here this morning. We think we have an excellent program, and we're happy to present it for you. To begin the program off this morning, I'd like to introduce Dick Katz. I know it says Dan Toder, but Dick's going to explain that he's not exactly Dan Toder. And so we certainly welcome Dick and appreciate his stepping in for Dan. So Dick.
Thank you, George. Yeah, Dan had another conflict, so just think of me as taller, younger, with more hair. And that'll be Dan. Oh, yeah, and I'm wearing a coat and tie because I don't do that. Anyhow, my name is Dick Katz. I am the board secretary of the LSRP Association. I fell asleep in a meeting and wound up in the position. Hopefully most of you have heard this presentation. I'm going to do it much more briefly than Dan does because he's more interested. Slide. The LSRPA was formed a couple of weeks after the passage of SARA to act as an advocate for the profession and also serve as a repository of information. We are a non-profit corporation with a board of directors consisting of 11 people. And that will change somewhat significantly next month when we have our annual meeting. The purpose behind it is to do what we can. I'm sorry? Oh, okay. I could shout or I'll just stand closer. Sorry about that. Could I have the next slide? I don't know how to work this thing and I don't want to be bothered. All right. The association is supported both by membership dues and by a number of annual sponsors. These are the guys who are most prominent in that group, and they're the ones who have provided this sumptuous repast this morning. Next slide. All right, we're facing a lot of mountains, guys. There's the new tech regs, there's the new ARCs, there's 16 guidance documents, but the 800-pound gorilla sitting right in the middle there, that's the licensing test. We'll get into that a little bit more in a bit, but that is coming up very shortly, and it's going to be a major obstacle. Next slide. These are the guidance documents. I believe there are 6 out final now, or 7, and another 9 pending. All of them are being worked on or are being trained. Today you're here for the Ecological Evaluation one. Next. Okay. This is the schedule. You can say it's a little out of date. The November 30th has already passed, obviously. That practical applications course apparently has gone over very well. I haven't had the opportunity to go myself, but it is scheduled again for February 7th. The licensing board has determined that that will qualify in place of the site remediation basics course that used to be offered, so that if you are a non-temporary LSRP thinking about taking the test, you probably should attend that course. The others obviously are scheduled, and they will be coming down the line as the guidance documents become available for, I guess, in final. Most of them are already in draft. Next. Okay. One of the largest groups within the LSRPA is the Regulatory Outreach Committee. It has a number of subcommittees that had been designed to parallel the DEP organization and deal directly with guidance documents. We are in the process of reorganizing that committee to line up better with the new organization of the DEP. Anybody who has not joined the LSRPA or has not become active in any of our subcommittees might want to consider it. It's a great source of information. Next slide. All right, here's the big one. Here's the test. I have a good deal of personal information regarding the mechanics. Obviously, no one knows anything about the content. I don't want to get into any great detail here, but I'll hang around after the meeting in case anybody wants to ask some questions. Basically, they have already completed the job task analysis. I was on that committee, and now they're getting ready to start writing the questions. And after that, it gets very interesting. Next one. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. You can leave it there. But all temporary LSRPs last week received a job task analysis survey from Caviart, the contractor for the test. Please return them. This is critical. The survey is designed to say what it is an LSRP does, and based on the weighting shown in that, meaning we do this frequently and it's very important, or we do it infrequently and it's not that important, the test will be weighted to reflect those items. Please return it. We don't want this to be an indefensible test that has 10 people respond. All right, why join the LSRPA? Well, you can save money on some of the courses. We are sponsoring a number in conjunction with both the DEP and with Rutgers, and there are breaks involved in that. I believe the NJDEP also gives a reduced tuition fee. Professional development is probably the most important thing. Until you've been involved with this, you're not going to be able to follow all the stuff that's coming down the pike. You get good synopses from us. There's access to the members-only part of the website, which is chock full of information, we hope, plus all the board minutes that I write. Actually, Linda writes them, I edit them. Get your name on there. You have a copy of that slide. What's the next one? Sorry about that. Oh, how to become a member. Pay the money, just like being an LSRP. Membership fees are relatively inexpensive than 1/6 what you pay for a license, $150 for LSRPs, and for associates, and free for students. Next. And that's that. As I said, I will hang around after the session in case you have questions about the test or the LSRPA. And I thank you. George, you're back.
Thank you very much, Dick. Thank you, Dick. Next, what I would like to do is just provide, for people who are not familiar necessarily with how the guidance development process works, I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to that, as well as just to let you know that the instructors for today's program have worked actually very hard. We've done dry runs, and they put these slides together. We have an excellent program with 2 people from DEP's Bureau of Environmental Evaluation and Risk Assessment, and that is Nancy Hamill and Alan Motter, as well as Chuck Harmon from AMEC and Carrie Ann Kajowski from Langen Engineering, and they will be up and presenting after me. So first, all right, Joe, I think you're going to have to advance that slide for me. That'd be back 2, I think. There we go. I just want to first just give an idea of how important the LSRP program is and what it's based on. We really have made major changes in the way the department is operating. We've revised our technical guidance. We've also revised our rules. The rules, really, we've taken out a lot of the how-to and have made them more performance-oriented and performance-based. And then the how-to we really put in the technical guidance. And they're some of the strongest building blocks for the LSRP program and really needed to be in place for this program to be successful. For the technical guidance committees, they're composed of both DEP staff and outside stakeholders. Their job really was to evaluate the current technical requirements for site remediation and to take out the elements of the how-to from that and to put those into technical guidance. The more prescriptive elements were to remain, or the prescriptive elements were to come out of the technical guidance and to allow those rules to be the performance-based and the objectives and the goals that you need to meet. The technical guidance committees really coordinated well with the people who are writing the rules so that the new rules and the guidance should be complementary and go hand in hand. In addition to that, the technical guidance committees were required to develop technical training, which is why we're here today. And this really, hopefully, should benefit both department staff as well as outside stakeholders. Next slide, Joe. So people might say, well, why involve stakeholders? And I think it's critical. Not only does SARA require us to do that, but it's a lot more than that. And I think the people who have been involved in the technical guidance committees would tell you this as well. It really provided a forum for collaboration, working together. Certainly was a trust-building event from the experience that I was involved in. It created consensus building, really was the different perspectives, people coming in the room and realizing that not everyone's perspective was the most important one. And consensus really doesn't say that I got my way, but it's the best balance of all the opinions and perspectives in the room, and hopefully that's what the guidance reflects. The guidance documents really were technically based, scientifically based. I think they're very well balanced. Perspective of human health and the environment, the protection, as well as reasonability. And I think that balance comes out in every guidance document that we have, and I think the teams have done a wonderful job. As far as the improved working relationships, I can tell you that my experience is a lot of the people who are in those the technical guidance committees actually have to work together at times, and that has actually the trust that is built just in the committees really is reflected in some of the work that the department does with the outside stakeholders. And I think that was a great idea to bring everyone together so that we do recognize that everyone has a different perspective, a different goal, different objectives, but we can work together to accomplish mutual objectives. In addition to that, again, I think it definitely helped the document quality from having all those different perspectives, and the review process as well. When we send it out to the stakeholders, we send it out within the department, is fairly robust. All the SRP bureau chiefs, assistant directors, and actually Assistant Commissioner Sweeney's office received the documents for review and comment. In addition to that, we sent it out to every stakeholder on every committee, and they were asked to send those out to their constituencies and have them review the document and provide those comments back to the committee chair. A lot of the committees received extensive comments. One thing that we have asked them to do is to address the significant comments, not the typographical errors or the philosophical comments, but the technical comments that needed to be debated within those committees. They actually have to address those comments and provide a response to the comments. That will be posted with each document when it's posted final. So it was a pretty heavy lift, and the technical guidance committees really did a fantastic job in doing this with a little bit of negative feedback. They weren't quite too psyched without having to put forth that effort, because just writing the document was a pretty heavy-duty lift as well. But we think it's important that people who do provide comments, that we do provide responses to those so that they understand what decisions we're making and why. The information exchange and training that we're doing now, I think it's important to get that information out and for everyone to understand understand the process. It's only going to improve the success of the program overall. This is just to remind us again what the rules versus guidance was. The rules, of course, what must be accomplished, the goals. It includes the performance objectives, timeframe standards, that kind of thing. And then the guidance really is the how-to. That's how we actually get to where we need to be. As far as variance from regulation, the requirements are in SARA Section 24B2, as well as the current technical rule. The requirements really are that you have to provide the citation, how the work deviated from the regulations, and also to document that the remedy is protective of human health and the environment, and that needs to be submitted in the next relative document. As far as application of guidance, we just wanted to point out that the department struggled a little bit because in the current tech rule, application of guidance as well as variance from rule are pretty much addressed the same, and that's really not how we are applying guidance or rules at this point. So what we really needed to do was just to issue, this is just a very brief document that's now on the department's website at this location. In addition to that, it's on the SRP guidance library. You can have a link from there just to make sure that you can access the document. What the document does, it just describes how we are expecting technical guidance to be applied. It certainly allows for the use of professional judgment. We request that if you did not follow the department's guidance, that you let us know what you did and why. And I think that's important for a couple reasons. I think it's important for everyone to understand what was done there, as well as if you are a LSRP who's taking over a case where previous work was done. I think it's very appropriate that you understand what was done in there and why, so that you understand your obligations on how to handle the site at that point. In addition, the department recognizes that we don't have one-size-fits-all guidance. Our guidance really has to apply to many different sites. We tried to include all the information that was necessary for every particular site. First of all, I think that's impossible to do because every site is a little bit different. In addition to that, the guidance document would be so voluminous no one would ever read it. So the idea is that we do have the ability to apply professional guidance. Please reference that paper. It kind of describes what the department expects, and I think it provides a little bit of direction and clarity to what we're doing in the future. Joe? One other thing just about that point. Someone had asked me then, why is the department's guidance important? I think it should be pointed out that the department issues that guidance because it is an acceptable way for the department for you to operate, or an acceptable approach. One thing that's required, if you don't follow that approach, you really have to document that it's still protective of human health and the environment. The department has kind of gone through that through these committees to identify an approach that requirement's already fulfilled. So therefore, if you follow that approach, you don't necessarily have to say why it's protective of the environment. It's assumed. If you don't, you do have to go through that process to document. This is already pointed out what the guidance committees are. As Dick had said, we do have 7 documents out there that are final and posted on the website. And we do have a couple that should be out either the end of this month or early in January. You can always access the department's website and look in the guidance library, and that's where that information will be posted. As every new document becomes final, we issue a listserv, which goes out and notifies the stakeholders as well as we will have that listed on in the guidance library, and you can access both the document as well as the response to comments. All right, Joe? Next up, we have Nancy Hamill, who's going to be, is this your slides, Nancy? Yeah. Okay, great. Oh, we're looking good then. So please welcome Nancy Hamill, and she'll do our first topic for today. Nancy.
Can I have the first slide, Joe? Okay. Well, welcome and thank you so much for coming and listening in. A great way to start out the work week, I think. Nancy Hamill, and George kindly introduced our other speakers, Carrie Jakowski from Langen, Chuck Harmon from AMEC, and Alan Motter from BIRA. I also would like to acknowledge and thank two other committee members, Greg Newman from BIRA and Ralph Stahl from the DuPont Corporation. Thanks to Tessie Fields, our facilitator during the year, and George Nicholas as well. And a special thank you to Christina Faust from SAIC, Dan Cook from AMEC, and Steve Burns from BIRA for their technical contributions. I know it really sounds like a lot of names, but really, we had a small committee and a large document, so I can't thank these guys enough for their hard work on top of their normal workloads. And the document really does reflect the consensus of the stakeholder and DEP members. We thought we had won the prize for the largest document. Come to find out, we were beaten by vapor intrusion. So maybe Dan and Christina can whip up some more technical appendices to help us out. I just want to start by saying that eco-investigations are highly specialized, and while the LSRP needs to understand the basics, we really urge you to consider hiring a qualified subcontractor who's a specialist in the area. It's just not possible to be an expert in all the disciplines that are needed. Next slide. Well, the document took us about a year to write, and it was posted on the department's website in August with the response to comments, all 250 comments, and which, by the way, were reviewed by the whole committee, and the responses reflect the consensus of the committee. The document was written to reflect the current tech rules. Just to add that extra challenge, the revised tech rules were proposed in August with the intention that they'll be promulgated in May of 2012. So just to be clear, the document is intended to be used now. Please don't wait until next May. We expect that all the final documents will need minor revisions to match the new tech rules, but the content won't change, so anything that's up on the web, please use it now. And Alan is going to be pointing out specific changes in the proposed tech rules that relate to the eco requirements. Next slide. Well, we wanted to reward you for coming out early on a Monday morning with some extra information. While the SRP's document review process is not specifically in our guidance and it's still evolving, we wanted to give you some insight as to what happens when you submit eco documents to the SRP. First, the EEs and ERAs would be submitted as part of the SI and the RI documents to the Bureau of Case Assignment, where they get an administrative check of the forms, things like that. And then they're transferred to the inspection and review program. From there, the inspector would determine if what's called a component review is required. This means that just the ecological portion would be submitted to my bureau, BIRA, and then a reviewer would be assigned and coordinate directly with the LSRP if there's things like any revisions needed or missing information, that kind of thing. They would work that all out together. And different components would go to different support groups. One reason we wanted to go over this, since the technical support staff are only getting specific pieces, specific components of the full submission, if there are important things like data tables or figures that aren't specifically in the ECO documents, that at least a good citation, a good reference as to where they're located in another part of the submission is included so that the reviewer can easily get their hands on it. The last point, and this is in the ECO guidance, if site-specific remediation goals for ECO are included in these documents, they require department approval, so those will definitely be forwarded as a component review to my bureau. It's kind of similar to an ARS request when someone requests a change to the soil remediation standards, but we do expect that it'll be a pretty small percentage of the sites that will get to this point. You'll see there are numerous off-ramps as we go through the process this morning. Sites will drop out if they have little or no or little eco concern. They'll drop out of the process early on. Next slide, Joe. Well, this is an outline of our training today taken from the table of contents of our document. We'd like to take about 2 hours to walk through it with you and explain to you not only what's there, but also why we made the recommendations and how best to implement them. So to the extent that we can, it'll be a how-to approach. There are a couple of sections we won't be covering. We felt they were boilerplate or self-explanatory, like the definitions, QA, QC. But I'll quickly go over the purpose and document overview. Alan is going to be giving the details on how to prepare an ECO evaluation. Carrie and Chuck will cover how to prepare ECO risk assessments. By the end of the morning, you will definitely understand the difference between these two things. And Chuck will also cover uncertainty. And then Alan and I will finish up with remediation goals and risk management decisions. Next slide, Joe. So let's begin with the purpose. Why do we need this document? Why do we need ECO evaluations? We have soil remediation standards, right? Those human health, residential, non-residential. Well, it's really important to understand, probably one of the most important take-home messages for today is that those standards are human health based, and they don't apply for the protection of eco-receptors in environmentally sensitive natural resources. While there are promulgated surface water quality standards for human health and aquatic receptors, the problem is there are no promulgated soil or sediment eco standards. They have to be generated on a case-by-case basis in accordance with EPA procedures as per the Brownfields Act. And when you think about it, I hate to use the word impossible, but it would be extremely difficult to have promulgated soil or sediment eco standards when you think of all the possible combinations of receptors, exposure pathways, and endpoints. So ultimately, the purpose of the EE and the ERA is to determine if a remediation needs to be conducted in an environmentally sensitive area. And if it does, it provides the data to develop these site-specific eco remediation goals. The guidance we designed is a tiered risk-based approach that's modeled after the EPA process, so we followed the law for that. But it's updated and more streamlined to accommodate the large number of sites we have in New Jersey, with clear guidance for sites with little or no eco concern to drop out of the process early on. And it also includes guidance that aren't addressed by the EPA guidance. So we think it's way more user-friendly. Next slide, Joe. Well, as far as the document overview, which is section 3 of our document, it really talks about the heart of the guidance, which are sections 5 and 6, and these represent the 2 tiers of eco investigation. Section 5, the EE, forgive me if I'm using EE, that's eco-evaluation. ERA is eco-risk assessment. Section 5 is the EE. It's the screening level tier, which ends in a decision either for no further action, to conduct a full risk assessment, and in a limited number of situations to move directly to a remediation. And that might be for a small remediation or a hotspot removal. The ERA process is described in Section 6, and it's more conceptual in nature. It provides multiple lines of evidence to verify if risk is present or not, and it provides data for the development of the site-specific eco-remediation goals. Next slide. There are several sections in the guidance that really set it apart from EPA guidance. For example, we came up with a section we called Guidance for Special Circumstances. We realized over the years that there are commonly occurring problematic or scientifically challenging issues that keep coming up and that require extra focus in the project planning stage. For example, we give special sections to wetlands, estuaries. Are wetlands, should they be treated as a soil or sediment? Are estuaries freshwater, saltwater? There's a section on PCB aerochlors versus congeners. Is it better to run the old, less expensive traditional aerochlors? Should you be running the more state-of-the-art, all 209 congeners? And there's also a really good section on how to conduct a dioxin investigation pursuant to the World Health Organization dioxin TEQ approach, toxic equivalency approach. That's really state-of-the-art, and it draws upon some lessons learned from our Passaic River project. Our guidance also contains a section for risk-based remediation goals, which has always surprised me, is not part of EPA guidance. It has a section on risk management decisions. EPA guidance does touch on this, but we think ours is a bit more concrete. And it also has some excellent technical appendices. So if there are any questions, there's going to be loads of opportunities for questions, and I can turn this over to Alan to get going with the eco-evaluation.
Actually, do you want to just take a couple quick questions? We have the ability to take just a couple quick questions for Nancy. Does anyone have any questions? Just an intro. We're going to get in a little bit heavier technical comments in a second. Or are there any questions? Excellent. You guys are really on the ball. I appreciate that. Thank you, Nancy. That was an excellent job. Next up, we have Alan Motter, who's going to give us some information on ecological evaluations. Again, we'll have a question and answer period at the end. But I just want to remind everyone, not only do we have the people in this audience, but we also have a internet audience that's participating today. Therefore, if you do have questions, please have the patience just wait for one of us to run around with a microphone so that everyone has the ability to hear the question as well as the answer. Thank you. Alan?
All right, thank you, George. My name's Alan Motter. I've been with the DEP about 16 years, about 22 years in the environmental field, and I'm going to be talking about ecological evaluations. Formerly, we used to call them baseline ecological evaluations. You might wonder why we dropped the baseline from it. Well, even though our terminology came out first, EPA came out with terminology of screening level ecological risk assessment, which was equivalent to our baseline ecological evaluation, and they called what we call a ecological risk assessment, they called a baseline ecological risk assessment. And so this provided for a lot of confusion with the terminology. And so with the issuance of this guidance document and the readoption of the tech regs, we felt we could tweak our terminology and avoid the confusion. The next slide, please. Ecological evaluations are applicable to all sites in the SRP, and the authority for this comes from the tech regs. In the receptor evaluation, which is section 119, in the proposed tech regs, this will be section 116. The site investigation portion has ecological evaluations, a requirement for that within the site investigation, and that's under section 311, I'm sorry. In proposed tech regs, 311 will no longer exist, and I have slides elaborating this later, and portion of the ecological evaluation will actually be in the receptor evaluation, and a portion of it will be moved into the remedial investigation. And then finally, remedial investigation of ecological receptors, or that's where you do the ecological risk assessment, is in Chapter 4.7 of the Tech Regs, which will be in the proposed Tech Regs Section 4.8, and Chuck and Carrie will talk about that later on. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, just a little bit of background on ecological evaluations. There's basically three parts. One, you want to identify, do you have any environmentally sensitive natural resources? And we have some references for that. Actually, I'll elaborate on that later. But you want to know, do you have anything that could potentially be an environmental receptor? Two, you want to know, do I have contaminants of potential ecological concern? And again, the word potential is in there because you want to know up front, are there any contaminants that could potentially affect the environmental receptors? And then finally, you want to link the two with a pathway. Is there any way for the contaminants that are on the site to get to the ecological receptor? Okay, now the difference between what's in the current Tech Regs and what's in the proposed Tech Regs and in our guidance, you're still doing all three steps. However, you'll notice that identification of COPEX occurs during the site investigation in both the current Tech Regs and the proposed Tech Regs. Identification of environmentally sensitive natural resources occurs again in the site investigation. However, the evaluation of migration pathways has been moved into the remedial investigation, and the reason for this is that during the site investigation, majority of the time, you only have data from your areas of concern. You haven't gone out and delineated anything yet, which is a stage that's done during the remedial investigation. Therefore, sites that didn't drop out because there was no environmentally sensitive natural resource or no contaminants would, 99% of them would come back and say, yeah, we have contaminants, yeah, we have environmentally sensitive natural receptor. However, we don't know if these migration pathways are complete or not. So we have to fill in these data gaps. So we figured, rather than always having the conclusion come to, well, we have to do more work, it made sense to follow, what's being done in your sampling scheme and have that evaluation moved into the remedial investigation. Next slide. Okay, so in the current Tech Regs, you, again, would draw conclusions from all three things. Do I have contaminants? Do I have environmentally sensitive natural receptors? And do I have a completed pathway? And then draw a conclusion, do I end everything here, or do I, go on and do further evaluation? The way we're doing it according to the guidance document and the proposed Tech Regs is you're going to look at, do I have any environmentally sensitive natural receptors? Do I have any potential contaminants of potential ecological concern? If the answer to either of those is no, you're done, and you don't go on any further with your ecological investigation. If the answer to that is yes, then what you're going to say is, okay, then during the RI, I'm going to evaluate my migration pathways. Next slide. It's important that you note that all three conditions, if all three conditions are met, then you have to go on and do further evaluation. However, if any of the three are missing, then you would, at that point, and I think I use the term NFA in here all the time. As an LSRP, it would be an RAO. Just when I say NFA, just consider those two synonymous because I don't have the terminology in there. But under the current Tech Regs, everything is done under 311, as you see there. Under the proposed Tech Regs, the first two steps will be under the receptor evaluation 116, and then the evaluation of migration pathways will be under 4.8, which is the current 4.7. Next slide, please. Okay, again, if all three conditions are met, you have to go on. If any of the three are not present, then you would NFA or your RAO would be, that you're finished at that point. You want to have a concise summary, written concise summary documenting the findings of the ecological evaluations. Okay, next. Okay, I'm going to go through what our guidance document says about each of these steps. Environmentally sensitive natural resources, you want to identify areas that are on site, adjacent to the site, and I have written here our old terminology, which says under the potential influence of the site. That has been changed to potentially impacted by the site. The reason for that was in speaking with our Office of Legal Administration, they felt the terminology for under the potential influence was a little vague. Potentially impacted by was a little more defensible. How do you identify environmentally sensitive natural resources? Well, the discharge of petroleum and other hazardous substances regulation actually has about a 3-page definition of what environmentally sensitive natural resources are under Chapter 1.8 of that guidance document. It's not intended to be all-inclusive. However, it's pretty extensive. It goes everywhere from natural dunes to migratory stopovers to wetlands to mature forested areas, and has a whole listing of them. Also, anything within the pinelands is going to be considered environmentally sensitive. During the ecological evaluation, you want to perform a qualitative survey to identify the vegetative habitat. Again, you're not doing a quantitative survey at this time. You're not setting up a grid. You're not going through measuring, diameter, breadth, height, or anything like that. Basically, what we want you to do is walk through and say, okay, this is an oak maple forest with about 80% oak, 15% maple, 5% other, or this is a spartina wetland. We just basically want to know what the habitat type is on a qualitative basis. It's important that the ecologist is familiar with the state and federal literature for identifying the vegetative community. It's actually a requirement in the tech regs. And you're going to do a visual estimation of the dominant plant species for each vegetative stratum per standard procedures. Okay, ideally you want to go out during the prime growing season, which is, early spring to late summer, and you want to identify anything, that would indicate stress on the vegetation, such as dying or brown leaf tips, bare patches, so on and so forth. You want to identify any wildlife that through actual sightings or for evidence, such as scat or you saw footprints or anything of that nature. Vernal pools are important to identify because there are some species which are obligate to vernal pools. Vernal pools are dry portion of the year, wet portion of the year, so they don't have any fish that are living there year-round to be predators. And so some amphibians and some reptiles are actually dependent on the vernal pools to breed. And you want to identify any water bodies on the site and note their size, morphology, so forth. All right, I threw this slide up here just because I said, you want to ideally go out during prime growing season. It doesn't always work out the way the schedules go. And we've been asked to use the arrow here rather than the laser pointer. But you can see that this is pretty bare area here. But you can also tell, from Dave's winter attire here and the trees and so forth, that this is in the middle of winter. But there's still things you can tell. When you look at this bare area, initially you might think, oh, it's a dirt road, but then you realize there's no ruts, from the tires and so forth. And actually, this is a chrome site, Liberty State Park. And chrome was placed, I guess, along a utility corridor. And if you're familiar with hex chrome, through capillary action, it does what you call blooming, where the chrome actually works its way up through the soil onto the surface And you go out there one day and see a yellow puddle. You might go out there the next day, it's not there, but the chrome residuals will still be there. And what we found is that, in fact, there were phytotoxic levels of chrome in this area. And then you can see the vegetation is a little bit thinner and shorter here compared to the vegetation in the background. And in fact, the chrome levels tail off as you go away from the site. So even if you can't go out during prime growing season, there's still observations you can make. All right, you want to present, within the ecological evaluation report, you want to present general description of the land use, including man-made features that are attractive. A lot of times people will not put man-made features because they say, well, it's a fire pond or a waste lagoon or whatever. But a lot of times these will have nice shallow banks and develop a nice wetland fringe, and it'll be teeming with fish, and you'll see wading birds in there. The fish and the birds don't know this is contaminated, and so they're going there and they're getting dosed. And especially if it's a bioaccumulative compound, you might have fish thriving in there, but then when the fish are eating them, it'll have toxic effects. So you need to have all the features listed. Vegetative cover type, map indicating the boundaries, aerial extent, habitat type, and a tabular listing of the species. And it's important to note whether they're year-round or migratory, because their exposure to the site will differ, based on whether they're year-round or not. And also their feeding guild, location of residence among the habitat types. If they're feeding on earthworms versus vegetation, their exposure is going to be different. If they're burrowing into the soil to live or living in a tree, their exposure is going to be different. You want to document that you've contacted the New Jersey Natural Heritage Program, and the contact information is listed up there, to identify whether there's any rare, threatened, or endangered species, because whereas for the most part we're concerned about population level effects, when it comes to threatened or endangered species, we're concerned with the individual effect. Also, if you use GIS, New Jersey's Landscape Project is good to get information regarding the vegetative cover type, whether there are any rare, threatened, endangered species. If you don't use that, you can go to IMAP, New Jersey DEP, and again, I have the websites listed there. And you can get all the information that you can get from the Landscape Project, but it's you don't need GIS to use it. And those are really helpful when you're creating your maps to identify, what vegetative types you have out on the site. Okay, the next thing is contaminants of potential ecological concern. And again, the word potential is in there. So at this point, again, you're in the SI. Most of your data that you're going to have is simply from the areas of concern and not from the environmentally sensitive natural resources. So it's still a potential concern because that contaminant could get there. So even though it's not in the environmentally sensitive natural resource, you're still going to compare it to ecological screening criteria to see if it's going to be a potential concern. You want to identify the contaminants you have out there according to chemical fraction, the detection limits, and statistical summaries really help if you can provide data mean, the UCL, concentration range, frequency of detection. This really helps because if you have say 100 samples and one of them exceeds screening criteria, your frequency of detection is going to show that this probably really isn't a concern. On the other hand, if 99 of them exceed and they're 10 times the screening criteria, then it's probably a concern. So if you can provide this type of information, it can paint a very quick picture for a reviewer to look at and come to the same conclusion that you came to. For surface water, you absolutely need to collect site-specific hardness and pH, because the surface water standards are based on are calculated site-specifically based on the hardness and pH as part of the calculation. So you need those parameters in order to calculate what your numbers are. Also, dissolved and total. Most standards, surface water standards, are based on dissolved. I think there's still one or two that might be based on total, but just having that information is very useful to know what the overall exposure is. And for sediment, you want to collect particle grain size, total organic carbon, and pH. Some of your nonpolar organics, the total organic carbon can determine what your severe effect levels would be, and pH will help to determine, your mobility of certain contaminants, especially metals. Particle grain size will help you determine if you are in a depositional area or an erosional area. So all that information is very useful and needed. You want to compare your data with the ecological screening criteria, and basically, if all of your data is lower than the screening criteria, at that point it would be no further action, or your RAO would say, you're finished at that point. If your data is above the screening criteria, you need to do further investigation. It does not necessarily mean you have to do ecological risk assessment. Does not necessarily mean you have to do a remediation. It means you have to do some additional investigation. That may mean collecting additional data. It may mean, okay, I have potential concern out here. I need to collect more data to find out if these contaminants are actually migrating to the environmentally sensitive natural area. It may be looking at your summary statistics and seeing, okay, I have some exceedances, but they're really not that big of a concern. Ensure that your method detection limits are low enough, because some of the screening criteria are quite low. And the reason that they are low is because if your data is below that, we're saying you're finished, you don't have to do any further evaluation. So we want to make sure that if you're saying that at that point, that it is not a concern. So make sure that your detection limits are low enough. If they're not, you may have to do a matrix cleanup. You may have to use an alternative analytical technique, or it may be possible that you're just not going to get down there, and then you're just going to have to explain it as an uncertainty. No COPEX or contaminant potential ecological concern can be excluded without adequate justification. Well, what's adequate justification? I've had people say, well, I have exceedances, however, the criteria are really low, so it's not a problem. Well, that's not adequate justification. I already explained why they're low. Adequate justification would be, I'll give you a specific example of a site I had where selenium was an issue. And the selenium screening criteria is 2 parts per million for soil. That's based on woodcock. However, that particular site would not support a woodcock, did not have the right habitat for it. The next most conservative screening criteria is based on white-tailed deer, and that took the criteria from 2 to 5. White-tailed deer are out on the site. All of the site data happen to be between 2 and 4 parts per million. So just by looking at what your actual receptors were, you're able to move off of the most conservative criteria, move up to the next one. That's adequate justification right there to just say, okay, I can exclude that contaminant. And you want to present the sample location, screening values, and data in what we call chem boxes, just indicating the location, depth, value compared to the screening criteria on a vegetative cover map. Again, a reviewer able to just quickly look at a map, see what you saw, can come to the same conclusions relatively quickly. Okay, now again, migration pathways. Excuse me, under the proposed tech regs and under our guidance, this is done during the remedial investigation. But basically what you want to do is look at the site topography, any surface draining features, and chemical characteristics to determine what the fate and transport mechanisms would be. So if you have something like, say, PCBs, they're going to tend to bind to organics and soils and so forth, and so it's going to be more of an erosional issue, whereas if you have something like, say, MTBE, which is miscible with water, you get a rain event, you get into the groundwater, it's going to just flow along with the water. In the ecological evaluation report, you want to present all of your actual observations or description of potential migration pathways. Again, actual observations would be, we have a drainage swale here and there's staining all through it right down into the wetlands. A potential would be, well, I have a drainage swale here, there's no indication of staining or anything of that nature, but there's a potential pathway here. So you want to present, whether it's an actual or potential. I actually had a site, an MGB site, where you could stand on the bank of the creek and you see about a 2-inch seam of coal tar just flowing out into the stream. Actual. So, direct observations could include presence of stressed or dead vegetation, as in that photo I had up earlier, discolored soil, sediment, surface water, presence of seeps or outfalls, such as at that MGP site, or if you see all the fish are belly up, there might be something going on there. Next one. Potential for contaminant migration pathways. Again, if you have a tidal situation, contaminants could actually be moved upstream during tidal reversals. You have storm events. You could have direct emplacement into environmentally sensitive natural resources. Again, around the turn of the last century, standard practice would be, you have industry or even a farm or whatever. Oh, go dump that in that swamp out back there. And so, you would actually have people, taking drums or, whatever off-spec material and throwing it in the wetlands out back. So you could have direct emplacement. Discharge of contaminated groundwater into surface water. If you have monitoring wells out there, you can track the plume, see if it's heading towards a surface water feature or a wetland. And food chain effects, particularly for bioaccumulating compounds. All right, I'm going to try to go through these next slides rather quickly. In our guidance document, we have recommendations on when and how to collect samples. And when to collect samples, again, if you have contamination above screening criteria, you have potential migration pathways, you have historic or ongoing discharges, stress vegetation, so forth. These are all reasons that you need to collect samples. For sediment and surface water, again, I already talked about those parameters, so I don't need to say it again. Where to collect samples, we go through different scenarios. If you different potential contaminant migration pathways, you have ditches or swales. How should you? Where should you collect samples within those features? Again, these are recommendations depending on the feature type, the size, and so forth. If you have overland flow or groundwater plume, where would you collect those samples? Within environmentally sensitive natural resources, if you have an indication that the contaminants are actually reaching the resource, we have recommendations for aquatic systems, whether it's standing water, flowing water, where you would collect those samples and how many. With wetlands, depending on whether it's an emergent scrub, shrub, or forested wetland, where again to collect the samples, and again for uplands. And then how to collect the samples, we refer to the Field Sampling Procedures Manual, but we have we go through this again, different methods of collecting them, and whether it's a surface discharge or a subsurface discharge, depending on the whether it's a volatile or a metal, you collect them in different manner. We go through the fact that we want discrete samples, not composite samples, and if there's a potential for scouring or dredging of sediments, how you would go about collecting samples there and where. For surface water features, if the contamination is due to seep or surface discharge, if the contamination is due to contaminated sediments, the depth at which you collect those samples could vary. And then just some general information on surface water. Okay, and we have a section here on background considerations. And background considerations are very important because they help you to refine your COPEC list. Again, when you first identify your contaminants of, again, potential ecological concern, you're looking at strictly what site data exceeds screening criteria. After you do that, then you can look at your background. So say you're in Burlington County and you're in the Glauconitic sands, your arsenic levels could very easily be naturally elevated. So you have arsenic levels on the site that are elevated. However, you go to background locations where there's no impact and you see elevated contaminants, you can then eliminate that metal as a potential concern. Help determine whether or not the COPEC is site related, and compare site levels to regional levels, and it'll help you to develop risk management decision goals, but that would be later on in the process. But if you know your background levels, it'll help you in that determination. Okay, a couple of points. As Nancy pointed out, ecological screening criteria are not promulgated. They also do not address bioaccumulation. You can propose alternative ecological screening criteria justifications, such as the example of selenium that I gave, or there's other reasons too that you might find for using an alternative number. However, human health-based soil remediation standards are not applicable to ecological receptors, so do not propose soil remediation standard for an environmentally sensitive natural resource. Okay, again, we go through what you should use to compare, what screening criteria you should use to compare your data to. And we go through migration pathways, ditches, and swales. Should you use sediment criteria or soil criteria? Well, it's going to depend on whether the standing water part of the year, all of the year, so on and so forth. Overland flow, groundwater, typically you're going to use surface water standards to compare your data to, because that's what your potential impact is going to be. For surface water bodies, we go through, whether it's fresh water or saline water, for both surface water and sediments, and what criteria you would use to compare your data to. For wetlands, we go through, determining whether something, the substrate within a wetland can act as a soil, it can act as a sediment, sometimes it can act as both. So we go through different scenarios of which criteria you want to pull out and compare your data to, and whether or not there's any surface water present, what you would compare that to. For uplands, we go through the different things, PRGs, which are preliminary remediation goals from Oak Ridge National Labs, eco-SSLs, which were developed by the EPA. And then soil remediation standards for uplands that could potentially be impacted. Now, this is not to say you use the soil remediation standards in lieu of eco numbers. You might have to use them in conjunction with eco numbers. If that area could potentially be impacted, you're going to have to look at both eco numbers and soil remediation standards. And engineering and institutional controls for uplands that could potentially be developed. That's elaborated more in the risk management decision process. And I've pretty much gone through all of this material, but Chapter 5.5 in our 5.5 in our document tells you, what all you need to present within the report. And again, if you do a tabular listing of all your data and highlight the exceedances, it's real easy to go down through and see, if one column is completely highlighted, that maybe that sample location is a problem. If one row is completely highlighted, maybe that certain contaminant is a potential problem. On the other hand, if there's little or no highlighting, you can very easily look at that and say, wow, there's really not much contamination out here. maps, on your figures, again, present the habitat types and location of samples and so forth. Okay, I think I already went through this. It's your what you want to present in your data tables, Joe. And then finally, within the report, you're going to identify, at this point, am I finished? Do I have enough data to say that there really is, little potential for any impact out here, and so no further action, or your RAO is going to say, we're finished at this point, or is there a need for a more rigorous study, which Chuck and Carrie will talk about in a minute. And you're going to identify any data gaps and recommendations on how to fill them, because a lot of times, again, it may not be necessary to do an ecological risk assessment at this point. It may just be necessary that you go out and collect some additional data to answer some questions. And then also, if you identify that there's a hot spot and the numbers are really high, that there's going to be a problem out there, but it's really confined to a small area, it may be more efficient at that point, rather than going through the whole risk assessment process, just to say, you know what, I'm just going to clean up, dig out, cap, treat in some manner this hot spot of contamination, and just get it out of the environment, so there's no longer any exposure to it, and not go through the ecological risk assessment. And this makes sense, again, for small hotspots that you might have on a site, where you're just going to look at, going to either the screening criteria or the background, whichever is higher, and just remediating that small area, and then saying, okay, now I'm finished. Okay, and that's it for me. Any questions?
Yep, we have time for some questions. We'll give preference to people in the audience, and as well, we may have some questions from the web. So we have a question over here.
Back before you said comparing the site contaminant levels relative to regional levels. Where do you find out the regional levels?
Actually, the Office of Site Science used to be a division of Science Research Technology or something like that. On the website has, I know, at least metals data for different areas, county by county. I know they have it for at least the county surrounding Burlington County. I'm looking up for that. I know they have it for the counties in northeast New Jersey as well. I'm not sure that they have it for every county, but there's certain areas that they did studies in. Nancy, do you know of any other databases that there are? Not for soils, but for sediments, there's some databases out there. I guess the Army Corps has some. The Army Corps, USGS, NOAA. If you have some specific questions on a media that you would want some regional numbers on, you can email Nancy, myself, even Greg Newman, and we'd be happy to get back to you. When we say regional, we do mean like within that county or within that topographic area, as opposed to regional being Boca Raton, Florida to Portland, Maine.
Okay, additional questions from the audience? Oh, hold it. Yep. Someone right back of you has the microphone.
The question is regarding the surface water. You indicated filtered or unfiltered. Is it a lab method you would require, or is field filtering also okay?
I think either one would be fine.
You had said you were not required to do additional investigation for background contamination. What about historic fill-related contamination that's a regional-wide issue? Are you required to do additional investigations for historic fill?
Yeah, we're talking about that later. No. Okay. Historic fill, the presumptive remedy is capping. In an environmentally sensitive area, especially if it's a wetland that has historic fill in it, you obviously would not want to fill that. So we do have a section in our document where we talk about issues like that. Historic fill, you do not have to delineate off of your site, as I'm sure you're aware. If the historic fill is all located within your site, it would be treated basically like an AOC, an area of concern. If it's a regional area, you would only be responsible for the fill on your site, and you would treat it like you would under the human health, where you're responsible for your impact. That may mean, for instance, we had a site where a stream was running through an historic fill area, and you had the banks eroding and causing sediment contamination. So you may have to cap the banks, something of that nature. It's really going to be a case-specific thing to look at.
We're going to take one question from the web. This is from Keith Gagnon. It says, does EE need to provide details on COPEX or sensitive areas if one of these are not present and RAO is obvious?
If you're absent either a COPEC or an environmentally sensitive area, you still want to identify, like say you have some contaminants but you have no environmentally sensitive natural resources, you would still say, well, yeah, we have some exceedances, however, there's no environmentally sensitive natural areas here, document that, and then at that point you'd be done. So it's not like you have to do anything real extensive. Again, if you have environmentally sensitive natural resources and no contaminants, you would want to document the fact that you do have the environmentally sensitive natural resources. However, you're absent contaminants, and then you'd be done at that. Again, it's not overly burdensome. You've already collected the data. You're just presenting it.
Great. Do we have other questions from the audience? Here we go.
I guess I just want to get a feeling for how flexible these things are. Like, I have a site with volatiles, chlorinated volatiles, so I don't really need to do dissolved and total. Is that right? Or do I have to explain to you why I didn't do dissolved and total? Because
again, that's only for metals.
Okay.
So
okay. Same with pH. I don't have to do pH if I got chlorinated solvents.
that would be correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and the document elaborates on that a little more. I was just trying to go through this really quickly, give you a flavor for it.
Other questions from the audience? Okay, seeing them, we'll take one from the web, from Michael Metids. Not sure, Michael, sorry, can't quite make out your name there. Meditz. In a wooded wetland, there is soil and not sediment. Do we compare the soil sample results to the sediment screening criteria?
No, you'd compare it to the soil screening criteria. And, again, the document elaborates on that. There are soil screening criteria, and, in fact, there's probably 5 different layers of them, everything from Oak Ridge to EPA, and there's numbers for avian receptors, mammalian receptors, and so on and so forth. Typically, you start with your most conservative number and work your way up from there. So, if the most conservative number is based on a certain receptor and you wouldn't expect that one to be present, then you can move off of that one and move to the next one.
Great. We'll take one more question. You can get the mic over there. Karen's making her way over there.
All right, this is a future use question. If we, for an NRD, you'd have to make wetlands somewhere. So what if as an area that you're proposing, you have to do the eco-evaluation? What would you compare that to? The soils, sediments, both?
Yeah, we actually work really closely with the Division of Land Use for proposed wetland areas. And what we typically do is, if you're creating a wetland, we'll have you collect samples at the proposed excavation depth, and then that would be, in fact, compared to the sediment screening criteria. So if you're proposing to change the use of an area, you would be looking at the future use. Excuse me. Also, when we go through the risk management decision, you'll see that if you're proposing to create a wetland, you're going to then have a covenant on that site that says it's going to be a wetland in perpetuity, and that will help determine what you compare it to.
Great. Thank you very much. I'd like to please join me in thanking Alan. Did an excellent job on that. Up next, we have Chuck Harmon, who's going to present on ecological risk assessment. Just to let everyone know, after this, we will be taking a 10-minute break after questions for Chuck. And I should have done this in the beginning, but for visitors not familiar with the building, restrooms are out this door. Make a left, and they will be on your right. Alternatively, you can go on the other side of the foyer through the double doors, and the restrooms are on your left at that point. So, Chuck.
Thank you. Okay, again, my name is Chuck Harmon. I'm a principal ecologist with AMAC Environment and Infrastructure. I was the lead stakeholder on helping to put this particular document together. And whereas if you go through Chapter 5, like Alan had spoke about, there's really not that much different between the old BEE activities that you were required to do and the ecological evaluation, or EE, process that we talk about. Basically, it's the semantics of the name, but a lot of the information that's in there is really not that new. The sections that Carrie and I are going to talk about now on the ecological risk assessment, there's always been the requirement in the tech regs that if you end up getting into an ecological risk assessment, that you conduct it in accordance with the U.S. EPA guidance. And what we've tried to do here is to provide you, the LSRPs, with more information as to how to actually do that. And so Carrie and I kind of tag team on this. I'm going to be talking about the process, what you actually have to step through to do it. She's going to be talking about some more of the details in terms of specific data collection, because there are a lot of things that you get into in the ERA that you're not necessarily going to be doing if you just do a fairly simple EE. One of the things I know I've talked to, I've been doing conducting ecological risk assessments and working in wetland environments for almost 25 years now. And in time and talking to people, there's always a great reservation to appropriately use ecological risk assessments. And what I always try to tell people to make sure that they understand, they're not things that should be like your PhD dissertation. What they are is they're very specific tools that you're hoping to resolve a question. You're looking at ultimately developing an ecologically based remediation goal that you can use. You can go to the department through the process and say, this is what we're going to do, this is what we're going to clean up, because really what that does is it provides you with a greater certainty of where you're going to be looking at. If you try cleaning up to, say, an ecologically based screening criteria, you're talking about something, it's by inherent nature very conservative. It's ultra-conservative. It tries to touch all the bases. It's not site-specific. It's a good way to start. You can say that, well, if I do my screening and I clean up to that number, well, then, more than likely I'm going to get all my problems. But if you have a large, complicated site that requires, something where, well, I'm not looking to spend my company's next year's income just on a remediation action, how do you winnow that down? How do you narrow down to what actually needs to be addressed in terms of a remediation? And that's where the ecological risk assessment comes in. For example, I have a site that has 3,000 parts per million of lead. If I look at the ecologically based screening criteria for lead, it's about 200 ppm. Okay, so that says I have a significant problem. However, if you take that 3,000, you actually work it through a food chain model, which I'll talk about the use of shortly, you can actually see that 3,000 parts per million under standard food chain model assumptions is not going to be deleterious to whatever ecological receptor that you're going to be focused on. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're all licensed to now get 3,000 parts per million of cleanup for your lead, but it tells you, again, the power of the tools that we work at. And again, a properly focused and spent ecological risk assessment is highly valuable. I worked on a project once where the ecological risk assessment actually ended up, costing about $200,000. It was a very large, intense process. However, we completely eliminated a remedial action that was going to cost us in the range of $8 to $10 million. So it's just a question of where you want to spend your money. Next slide, please. Okay. The technical guidance for preparing ecological risk assessment, basically says that, and did I drop my glasses over there? No, got them in my hand. Never mind. 25 years, what can I say? Okay, basically says that if the EE indicates that there's further ecological evaluation, you're supposed to conduct this further evaluation pursuant to the form of an ERA, and that the ERA must be conducted in accordance with steps 3 through 8 of the ERAGs, or the Ecological Risk Assessment Guidance document per the Superfund. Now, next slide, please. Just to reinforce what Alan mentioned, and again, these are decision points that you as the LSRP have to make. You complete your EE. You have to decide, is no further ecological evaluation appropriate? Is further ecological evaluation required? As Alan said, can I collect a few additional samples, fill in a data gap, revise my EE, and then, say that answers all the questions? Or do I need an ecological risk assessment? Then the final decision point, again, on your part is going to be, a simple site. Maybe one or two, maybe some sort of environmentally sensitive natural resource, but it's small. Maybe there's very little in the way of connection. Whatever, gasoline service station, something like that. Can I get by just with simply remediating to, the ecological screening criteria or background, whichever is higher? So again, those are the 3 decision points that you as the LSRP are going to be looking at. Now, the ecological risk assessment I mentioned is called the Ecological Risk Assessment Guidance for Superfund, the process for designing or conducting ecological risk assessments, or commonly in the parlance of we risk assessors, simply called ERAGs. Now, the ERAGs document, talks about the ecological risk process as being 8 steps. And the DEP basically uses just the last 6 in this process that we're going through. And so, what I'm trying to do here basically is going to be outline the process that that you as the LSRP will be responsible for should you decide to move forward with an ecological risk assessment. And again, just to emphasize, the idea of the ERA is it's going to fit, it's going to move into, it's going to feed into the decision-making process for a remedial action. What are your cleanups, what kind of risk management? Risk management in particular, Alan's going to be talking about here in a very short minute. Next slide, please. Okay, and again, the ERAGs process talks about 8 steps. So I just mentioned these first 2 just so you know what they're called. The step 1 is called a screening level problem formulation, effects evaluation. Step 2 is the screening level exposure estimate and risk characterization. One of the things that if you pick up the ecological risk guidance, the ERAGs document, and we actually mentioned it in our document, are these points called SMDPs, or Scientific Management Decision Points. Basically, there's spots in the process where if you're doing it with the EPA, those are the points and times when you go in and say, okay, EPA, this is where we're at. You reach a decision as to what you've done so far. If you're looking at, you as the LSRP, again, this is a point maybe to key in and think, this is a decision point or a time in the process that I need to, again, step back, look at it, evaluate it a little bit more, make sure that I'm heading in the right direction. Next slide, please. Okay. So the last steps that you're talking about, which again in the EPA is called the Baseline Ecological Risk Assessment, or BERA. In our guidance document is the Remedial Investigation of Ecological Resources, or the Ecological Risk Assessment. 6 steps. First is a problem formulation, study design, field verification of that sampling design, site investigation, risk characterization, followed up by risk management. Next slide, please. Okay, just to give you a little background, just, again, so people are comfortable with, at least semi-comfortable with what an ecological risk assessment is. An ERA is the evaluation of the likelihood that an adverse ecological effect may occur or is occurring as a result of an exposure of one or more stressors. Next slide, please. Okay. For the EPA, the stressors can be chemical, which is primarily what we're involved with, but you can also use the process to evaluate such stressors as physical or biological issues. Next slide, please. Okay. But basically what an ERA is, it's a multidisciplinary process for collecting, organizing, and analyzing information. You're basically taking all what you have and slowly but surely winnowing it down through a variety of steps, or quite often tiers, where you start out with something, again, the EE, very conservative. You start moving it down more and more, collect more and more site information, and hopefully come through the process where you finally have a very objective, very unequivocal decision as to, what are the true risks associated with my site. Next slide, please. A risk assessment basically is set up a lot along the lines of the EE. You're basically looking at a source, you're looking at a pathway, you're looking at a receptor. And the key here is the fact that you have to have all three to actually have a risk. So an ERA, an ecological risk assessment, is going to be evaluating things, again, coming out at the end, what is considered to be the true risk to whatever receptors you're concerned with that this source is posing to your site. Next slide, please. Okay. The ecological risk assessment is conducted per the 8-step paradigm, or, the last 6 steps that ERA has. The problem is, and we get into this a little bit back in the document, the problem is that the 8-step paradigm is actually based on the original 3-step paradigm that the US EPA came up with back in the very early 90s. And it kind of streamlines down the process, and so in our document we kind of talk about these steps, still considering the fact that, you as the LSRP, have to go through this 8-step or last 6 steps to be able to perform this. But basically, a risk assessment includes a problem formulation, an analysis, and a risk characterization. The analysis in particular considers 2 particular topics, the characterization of your exposure and the characterization of the ecological effects. And again, the document that we put together talks about all these in light of the kind of information that you need. Next slide, please. Okay, just to go through some of these things so you have at least a feel for what we're talking about here. A problem formulation. If there's anything else I would like you to come away with in this particular course in terms of understanding the stuff I put together, is that this is your most critical stage of developing an ecological risk assessment. You get into data collection, that's mechanistic. You're going out and collecting samples in different areas. You look at how to identify the risks from that. Again, there's a lot of mechanics that go into it. This part here, where you're trying to decide what is my problem and how am I going to attack it, that is your most critical point of the ecological risk assessment. So the problem formulation stage, and again, we talk about this in the guidance document, is intended to be the point where you define your problem. You identify what kind of characteristics that you think you need to, to resolve and identify the problem. So you're doing things like identifying the ecosystems at risk. You're looking at the potential effects. You're selecting your endpoints, which I'll speak about. And above all, you're developing your conceptual site model. Next slide, please. Okay. One of the things that you get into in an ecological risk assessment are the development of things that are called endpoints. You have 2 types. You have an assessment endpoint and a measurement endpoint. And again, the idea here is to expose you to this. It goes into these particular points very clearly in the document. But there are two, endpoints that you need to at least be comfortable with. The assessment endpoint is a neutral expression of the actual environmental goals that you're looking to be protected. They're generally defined by an ecological entity and measured by an attribute of that particular entity. So, and again, I'll give you an example of that in just a minute. So the assessment endpoints that you may be looking at, and what you get into is going to depend on the size and complexity of your site. If you have a simple site, again, you may not even get into the ERA. If it's something that has some mid-level of complexity, your assessment endpoints and ultimately your measurement endpoints are going to be defined commensurate with that level of complexity. If you move to a highly complex site, you have multiple resources, multiple environmentally sensitive natural resources, then you're going to have to maybe look at a broad brush, a number of assessment endpoints and the various measurement endpoints that go along with them, ultimately all of which would have sampling and evaluation techniques that would go along with those. Next slide, please. Now the measurement endpoints, as I said, assessment endpoints are neutral expressions. They're things that you want to protect, that you want to evaluate, but they're not things you necessarily have the ability to directly evaluate or directly predict. So I say my assessment endpoint is I want to evaluate the potential impacts to the aquatic environment. Well, what does that mean? So I need to have something that I can actually measure in the field that I can use to reflect that particular assessment endpoint. So go to the next slide, please. So example, I have an assessment endpoint that says that, I want to evaluate the potential for adverse changes in the survival, reproduction, and growth of a fish population using a river in the vicinity of a site resulting from exposure to potential Copex found in sediment, surface waters, and or prey. So that's my assessment endpoint. It's very global. I want to evaluate this particular topic. Now, to actually measure that, now I have all these other things that I could be looking at. And these are actually things I can measure in the field. Surface water sampling results, surface water bioassays, fish tissue analysis, sediment sampling results, sediment bioassays, bioaccumulation studies, benthic to fish food chain modeling. So I actually have 7 measurement endpoints that I could potentially use for this assessment endpoint if my site warranted it. So again, that's something that you, as the LSRP, ultimately have to make the decision of. The selection of endpoints, you basically want endpoints that, in defining what is, going to be your assessment endpoint, you want to be looking at things that are that are very unambiguous. They can be defined, through a legal aspect, regulatory, maybe a public concern. The measurement endpoints, there has to be a direct relationship between the two. You can't say that I'm going to, my assessment endpoint is looking at the aquatic, aspects of this particular site, where my measurement endpoint is going to be looking at the trees and the nearby wetland. There's no connection between the two. They have to be directly related. Next slide, please. So the characteristics of what a good endpoint are: social relevance, biological relevance, unambiguous. Again, you want to be very specific, very comprehensive on what you decide. They have to be measurable. So if you're actually going to be identifying a measurement endpoint, you actually want it to be something that you can go out in the field and say, okay, I can take this sample, I can collect this, whatever it is, and measure it. And it has to be susceptible to the hazard. So, if you're trying to evaluate, say, a metals problem, and you end up, looking at, some potential effect, you have to make sure that, chromium or lead or whatever it may be actually has the potential to cause that effect. And again, logically related to the decision process. Next slide, please. Okay, all that again comes to the ecological conceptual site model, your last step in your problem formulation stage. This describes all the relationships. Again, it identifies potential sources, you look at complete, incomplete pathways and decide on your potential receptors, both primary and secondary. Next slide, please. So, for example, this is what a simplistic sample may look like. Conceptual site model. It goes through, identifies your sources, looks at release mechanisms, and you finally come down to, okay, here are my potential receptors, and the little black dots show you what the complete pathways are. So if once you've gone through this exercise, then when I actually do the ecological risk assessment, move to the mechanistic, collecting samples, evaluating data, whatever it may be, those are the places where I'm going to focus on. I don't need to waste time on things that are incomplete, because again, if you remember that source pathway receptor, well, there's not a pathway and there's not a receptor, then there's no risk. So that's something that an ERA I don't really need to get into. Next slide, please. Okay. Again, step one, problem analysis or problem formulation. Step two is analysis. Contains two particular steps. One is the exposure characterization. Carrie will be talking a lot about that when it comes to her time, because really where she's going to be getting into is a lot of data collection techniques, things that you would use to be able to evaluate stuff. Also, to some extent, she'll be getting into the effects assessment information that you would get there. But basically, this step of the ERA is, one, you decide what is my exposure, what are my in the EE what your general potential is, or what a some level of understanding. But the ERA is that you're really trying to pin that down. You're trying to decide what the full breadth, width, depth, whatever it may be, of exposure is related to the environmentally sensitive natural resources. The effects assessment that you start looking at, well, if I have chemical XYZ, what is chemical XYZ either potentially or actually doing to the environmental, to the ecological receptors that happen to be found in this environmentally sensitive natural resource. Next slide, please. So the exposure characterization, again, you're looking at, what's my, type of exposure, what's the intensity or concentrations, what's the duration, are we looking at an acute or a chronic, what's the frequency, is this a single event, continuous, episodic, timing related to ecological or biological cycles. This is one thing, again, people may not get into. If you have a very complex site, particularly wetlands, you start looking at things that may impact, if it's a periodic or an episodic type release, is it coming, that release occurring during, the short time of growing season when, certain animals may be spawning or plants may be growing, that it has the greatest potential to impact them. So that at least needs to be considered. Occurrence, is it homogeneous across my site, or is it fairly heterogeneous? And scale, what's the geographic extent of it? Next slide, please. Okay, some of the tools for conducting these kind of exposure assessment could be desktop, chemical data, which again Carrie will talk a lot about, tissue residue data, bioaccumulation, and biomarkers. Okay, the effects assessment, basically, again, you're just determining what is the impact of those chemicals that you've identified in the exposure assessment on the biota that I have in my environmentally sensitive natural resource. So again, how do you do that? It could be literature studies, it could be tox tests, it could be ambient tox tests, field studies, biological surveys. Again, there are a lot of different steps that you can go through. You finally get to the last part of the risk assessment, and that's actually called the risk characterization. And this is actually where you start deciding, do I have a risk? What is the concentrations posing that risk, and ultimately then what would be the concentrations that I could relate to a remedial action goal that I'm looking for doing. Okay, next slide. One of the ways that you'll see that risk assessments, risk characterization is done is through what's called the hazard quotient process. This is something where generally you'll compare some value to a benchmark. Okay, so It could be, the exposure concentration you've identified in sediments and surface soil or surface water to whatever screening benchmark that you're looking at. And it's a fairly simplistic, approach that, if you have, divide the concentration by whatever the benchmark is. If you have, if the benchmark is less than 1, then, the potential for an adverse effect is minimal. You're not really going to have a problem. If you have an HQ greater than 1, then, you have a potential problem. It's one of the things I always emphasize to people is that just because you have an HQ greater than 1 is not confirmation that you have a problem. It simply says by that mechanism you have a potential problem. I've seen sites with certain chemicals where you can have an HQ, of 100, and you do all these, other type tests, whether it be toxicity tests, whether it be biological surveys, and the critters and the plants and whatever are just having a grand old time. So again, it's a good indication that there's the potential for a problem, but you have to take that in light of all the other tests that you may be looking at. And then finally, the uncertainty evaluation, the ecological risk assessment. Again, this is your opportunity to, as the eco risk assessor or the LSRP, is to decide, what are the uncertainties associated with my project that I'm doing, the ERA. And it's, something you do either qualitative or quantitative, but it basically says, how is my risk assessment biased? Is the sampling and the whatever I've done and how I've looked at everything, is it biasing the risk assessment one way or another? And again, it gives you as the LSRP an understanding to make sound decisions as to, again, where you're going based on those particular things. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, I know everybody's going to look at the next slide and they're just going to totally freak, so I'm warning you right now, there's not a test. You don't need to remember this. One of the tools you get into in ecological risk assessment is called food chain modeling. And basically, what that does, the process is, if you have something that's growing or directly exposed to a medium, say fish swimming in surface water, plants growing in soil, those particular organisms or biota are going to be exposed on a very constant basis. So it's easy to make a direct comparison to what is in the media to what is potentially risk-bearing to those particular, to that biota. When you look at wildlife, though, the issue is, because wildlife are mobile, they're not going to be exposed on a continuous basis. So now you have to start thinking about, well, what actually is the biota taking in? So you start calculating what's called a dose. And it's the calculation of what's called an average daily dose, and it's how much is that, white-tailed deer, that mouse, whatever it may be, bird, whatever you're focused on, how much is it taking in on a daily basis? And then you compare that to values in the scientific literature called TRVs, or toxicity reference values, that say that, well, this particular dose to, either this critter or a surrogate for that critter is, either going to have an issue or not have an issue, and then you would come up with your HQ. If you have less than 1, not a problem. If it's more than 1, now you're talking about a much stronger percentage or much stronger indication that there is something problematic with the area that you're working with. The actual formula for doing that, again, this is all in, next slide please, this is all in our document, but basically you're just looking at what is all the exposure pathways or mechanisms for that particular critter to be exposed. So how much is it getting in food? How much is it getting through incidental ingestion of sediments or soils? How much is it getting through water? And all this is gone over in fairly deep detail in the guidance document to give you an idea on how to collect it. Again, just one of the tools that you get into in an ERA. Next slide, please. When you get into modeling, you have to go through a variety of steps, decide what you're going to be looking at, what kind of chemicals that you use. One of the things, to emphasize here, if you get into food chain modeling as part of your risk assessment, And go to the next slide, please. Is that, there are a lot of limitations to it. If you try to do things, and again, this is where you as the LSRP moving to, these higher levels of an ecological risk assessment need to make a conscious decision as to how to approach them. I can take a soil sample and I can model it all the way up the food chain to a bald eagle feeding on something that feeds on something that consumes the plants that's growing in the soil. The problem when you do that is that you start reaching such high levels of uncertainty that just by the model it becomes very, very conservative, highly conservative. So you have to decide, depending on what you're looking at, is it better to spend a little bit more money and gather some site-specific data to feed into that model, or is it better to just run the model from the soil up? For example, we worked on a project once, a metal site, right off the 287, and wooded wetlands area, and we were looking at, what was the potential impact to contaminants in the soil to white-tailed deer. We started out with the standard food chain model. Boom, boom, we predicted that the white-tailed deer would be impacted by feeding on plants in that particular area. So what we did is says, well, I have a hard time believing that. So let's go back, and what we did was to go back and actually look at the numbers that we had for plant uptake. So we started, refining, what the soil could give, how the metals were moving, how was it actually going up into the plants. We knocked it down by an order of magnitude, the concentration going to deer, which actually still left us with a risk. So we then said, well, let's go back and actually collect some plant samples and see what the plant sample concentrations were actually still another order of magnitude lower than what we had predicted the second time. At that point, there was no risk to the white-tailed deer. So again, you have to decide, what is going to be beneficial to you as the LSRP making decisions as to how to address potential problems at a site. It may be a simple site. You may not need to do, soil plant sample or fish samples or whatever it may be. It may be a complicated site where, again, that expenditure of funds to get site-specific data is going to provide you with the information you need to make a very logical decision on the potential risks at my site and then how to potentially remediate them. Next slide. Bioaccumulation is something else that you get into. I won't spend a lot of time. Basically what bioaccumulation is, particularly with certain organic chemicals, some of the chlorinated herbicides, pesticides, they have the ability to magnify as they go up the food chain. So if you have a plant growing in, an area contaminated by DDT or some of these other, old friends, the concentrations will start to magnify. A herbivore comes and feeds on that. It will actually concentrate those particular constituents in its, in the tissue. Something feeds on that, it concentrates it even more. If you look at the ecological evaluation, you're not and should not consider bioaccumulation factors. You're looking at things from a very conservative standpoint. As you get into the ecological risk assessment, this is where you can start looking at some of those kind of issues. Next slide, please. Let's go ahead and go on to the next slide because we're starting to run out of time. Just to finalize with some discussions on what's called weight of evidence. I talked about assessment endpoints and measurement endpoints. Basically what all the measurements endpoints act as are what are called lines of evidence, and there are research or investigative approaches that I handle during my ecological risk assessment. And what the weight of evidence approach is, and this is what the risk assessment calls for, in the risk characterization stage, is to take this weight of evidence approach, examine all my lines of evidence and say, well, the preponderance of data says, from these, 5 out of 8 lines of evidence says there's not a problem. So I would conclude there's not a problem. If I have 5 out of 8, 6 out of 8, 8 out of 8 that say there is a problem, obviously then I have a problem that ultimately will need to be remediated. Next slide, please. Okay, just commented on it. So lines of evidence, again, any investigative step that you do in your risk assessment, matrix sample, biological sample, toxicity testing, bioaccumulation tests, each of those is considered to be a line of evidence. Next slide, please. And then you would simply take those lines of evidence and weigh them, decide, in this, simple analysis we had 2 lines of evidence, but we decided one was, of stronger weight than the other. So again, that's just your way of going through the process and deciding what my potential risks are. And finally, to the ecological risk assessment report. And again, we talk about this in the guidance document, but this is kind of typically what you would project or what you would present in an eco report. You start out, you'd have an executive summary, decide what your objectives are, what your problem formulation is. Next slide, please. Go through whatever field activities you may have presented, present your results, your uncertainty analysis, and finish up with conclusions leading to your appendices, which should also contain all the laboratory analytical data. And these are some of the things you should consider in preparing your ERA. Examine your lines of evidence, present all the risks, present the likelihood of risks, talk about the location and areal extent of contamination, and potential half-lives and the potential for natural recovery. And that's it as far as the first step in ERA development. So I guess there are any questions.
Great. Thank you, Chuck. Again, we're taking questions, and please work with us on getting you the mic just so that people on the web have the benefit of hearing your question as well as the answer. So any questions from the audience? Boy, you must have been really good, Chuck, because I don't see any questions here. Okay, do we have anything from the web? We do. We have one from Gregory Flanagan. It says, if the EE process indicates that a small hotspot remediation, i.e. a small area of impacted soils, sediment, a swale, makes sense for a site, can the RP proceed with hotspot remediation to ESC without departmental review and simply document remedial action in an EE document?
Well, I'll answer that. Basically, that's a yes. Again, that was part of the I'm being told to speak into the mic. The process is, yes, that's one of the decision points. If you have a simple site, you're able, as the LSRP, to make the decision, let's forego any future investigation, just remediate the hotspot. And I think as far as documentation, Alan, is any other further things they have to go through, like with the RAOs or anything else?
No, they just remediate, document that they remediate to either the ESC or background, and at that point they would be done because the contamination is gone at that point, or the exposure is gone.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Whoop, we do have one from the audience over here. Hold on.
I guess this is an exposure scenario question. Suppose you're not going to be able to remediate immediately, but let's go back to the white-tailed deer situation where you have an issue where right now if you run through the ERA, you're probably going to have a problem, but the plans are for this particular site that you're going to pave this 2-acre out of a 100-acre site that has the high concentrations, and you're going to do that in a 2 to 3 year period down the line. Is there some opportunity for an exit ramp out of the ERA at that stage?
Yeah, I think I heard that. I actually would defer that to some of the DEP staff because that would seem to be handled through the risk management process when you implement a potential remedial action.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be an off-ramp from the eco risk assessment process.
Right.
There would be scheduling issues. Gosh. I would say that might qualify for what we call technical consultations if there is ever a site-specific issue like that. Of course, we would prefer remediation as expeditiously as possible, but that may be a situation to come in and meet with some of the appropriate support groups to talk about that. But it doesn't, there is not an off-ramp from the ECO evaluation risk assessment process. It's just a question of scheduling.
Right.
I honestly don't know that we're the right folks to answer that. But that's,
What was that?
I think that's about the best I can do.
Okay, that would be handled through probably through a remedial action work plan. You know, just deciding when you would actually come forth and do the work. I mean, it's a logical approach, but you know, it would, you know, just probably that would be the mechanism, I suppose. It doesn't. It's not not a ramp off the ERA process. It's just a matter of when you're able to actually do the work that you propose.
And again, I would point out that all of our documents aren't written to address every site. So if you do have situations that are very specific site related that don't necessarily fall into those categories, technical consultation really is the way to go to help the DEP understand those and to get an answer. Nancy said the instructions on how to schedule the technical consultations are on the DEP's website. Okay, we're going to take a 10-minute break. Thank you very much, Chuck.
Thank you.
So please be back here at 11. We will start on time, so thank you.